Some people start their week with coffee. Ale starts hers with ghosts, mysteries, and things that go bump in the night. Welcome to Macabre Mondays, the podcast where mysteries meet the macabre. Join Alejandra, a lifelong storyteller with a passion for the strange and spooky, as she shares chilling tales with her husband Tom, who's hearing them for the very first time. It's part marriage, part mayhem, and all mystery. Your weekly escape into haunted history, unsolved oddities, and the darker corners of life. New episodes drop every Monday, so ditch the morning blues and press play on something a little more macabre. Listen to Macabre Mondays wherever you get your podcasts.
What would you want your final words to be if you had the chance to choose them? Would you want them etched into memory, something poetic or profound, something that lingers? Maybe you'd hope they'd become comforting, a soft echo for those you leave behind. Or maybe you'd want them to be remembered, not just by loved ones, but by history itself. There's a strange power in last words. They can be a farewell, a confession, a riddle, and sometimes they become more than just a whisper at the end. They become the beginning of something else entirely.
Welcome to Down the Crooked Path. I'm your host, Amanda Joy. Join me as we dive into eerie and spine-chilling stories that blur the lines between reality and the unknown. From cryptids and mysterious disappearances to true crime, UFO sightings, and paranormal activity. Venture into the unknown and uncover the secrets that lie down the crooked path.
What happens when those final words aren't a goodbye, but a gateway? When they raise more questions than they answer and the person who spoke them vanishes into a fog of uncertainty. In one case, a single utterance, cryptic, haunting, and seemingly meaningless, has echoed for decades, not because of what it said, but because of what followed it. And that's where the story begins. Sometimes a single word is all it takes. Not a scream, not a confession, not even a sentence. Just one word, written or spoken, and the scaffolding of a person's reality begins to buckle. In a clinical setting, the appearance of a cryptic writing, especially when it emerges suddenly, obsessively, or with symbolic weight, is often the first sign that something is wrong. A psychiatrist might call it a proto-marker, but in the moment, to the person writing, it feels like revelation. The word becomes a key, a cipher, maybe a command, and once it's written, it can't be undone. In cases of schizophrenia, delusional disorders, or dissociative fugue, the language itself begins to fracture. Words lose their shared meaning. Syntax collapses. What's left is kind of a linguistic debris, like word salad. Patients might write pages of symbols, invent alphabets, or phrases that loop endlessly, each one feeding into the next like a snake swallowing its own tail. In one documented case from 1973, a man in Oregon filled 3 notebooks with the word glass, written in varying sizes and orientations, convinced it was the only thing keeping him from disappearing. In another, in a London asylum in 1898, a person carved the word mother into the walls of his cell 417 times before falling silent. These symbolic fixations signals a break, a moment where the mind no longer recognizes the boundaries between thought and reality. And when that happens, the word becomes more than just a language. It's evidence. Michael Foucault argued that madness and language converge at a threshold where meaning begins to fracture. When language overflows, clarity drowns, words twist, pile up, and lose their grip on meaning. In his studies of asylums and confinement, he traced how the institutional gaze sought to contain not just the body but the voice. Madness was not merely a condition, it was a disruption of communicative order. The moment language ceases to function as a bridge between mind, it becomes suspect. The person who spoke in riddles, who wrote in symbols, who insisted on meanings that no one else could verify, was no longer seen as eccentric, but they were seen as symptomatic. Writers who have lived within that rupture often left behind texts that were difficult to interpret. Anton Artaud was institutionalized multiple times, and he filled his notebooks with phonetic fragments, invented syllables, and violent disruptions of grammar. His spells and incantations weren't literary devices for his work, but they were attempts to claw through the veiled perception. Virginia Woolf, in her final years, allowed her prose to drift into disjointed rhythms, unfinished clauses, and shift suddenly in tone. Her journals and letters revealed a mind struggling to hold on to coherence, even as the structure of language itself began to slip. Literature has long treated madness as both a terror and a temptation. In Gothic fiction, a single word might carry a curse, a bloodline's doom, or a secret too dangerous to speak aloud. For example, Edgar Allan Poe's Raven quoting Nevermore. In modernistic texts, it might fracture a character's identity, rendering them unrecognizable even to themselves. As a person's mind begins to unravel and the original meaning loses their shape, a single word can shift in function. It no longer serves as a tool for communication, but instead becomes a symbol tied to something fractured and unresolved. This word may surface in notebooks, inside letters that were never sent, or in one-sided conversations. Its meaning is often never understood to those nearby, and yet, for the person who wrote or spoke it, the word carries weight. It can be a warning or something tethered to something only they can sense. Günther Stoll was 34 years old. He lived in Anhausen, a quiet village in West Germany surrounded by farmland and low hills. He had trained as a food engineer and worked in the industry for a time, but by the mid-1980s he was unemployed. His days had grown repetitive, spent mostly at home, occasionally walking into town, sometimes visiting his parents. He lived with his wife in a modest house and kept to himself, and had no history of violence or instability. Neighbors described him as polite, if somewhat distant. He had no criminal record, no debts, no known enemies. His life, from the outside, appeared rather uneventful. He had once been sociable according to friends from his earlier years. He liked football, enjoyed tinkering with electronics, and had a habit of collecting technical manuals even after leaving his job. But something had shifted. He had grown quieter, more withdrawn. He stopped attending local gatherings and rarely answered the phone. He seemed increasingly preoccupied. By the autumn of 1984, he spent most of his time alone. Stoll had begun to speak of people his wife had never met nor seen, people Stoll couldn't name. He referred to these individuals as them or they. He never explained who they actually were, and he believed whoever they were watching him and interfering with his life as if they were plotting something. There was never indication that these people existed. There was never any phone calls or letters from them, no sightings. But just the same, he was convinced that he was being targeted. When questioned by his wife, he would shut down and try to change the subject. Sometimes he would grow agitated, pacing or muttering and then falling into long silences. Other times he would speak calmly, as if describing something ordinary, something everyone should already know. The paranoia crept deeper and deeper into his everyday movements. He would check the windows, lock the doors twice, sometimes 3 times. He stopped trusting the mail and avoided certain roads. He said they were trying to poison him but offered no evidence. His wife tried to reassure him, but absolutely nothing could ease his mind. On the night of October 25th, sometime around 11 o'clock, Stoll and his wife were sitting quietly in their home. Nothing unusual occurred that evening. Then, without warning, Stoll shot up and exclaimed,
"YOGTZE geht mir ein nicht.
The phrase translates to, "Now I've got it," or more precisely, "Now a light comes on for me." He never explained what had become clear, nor did he offer any context. Instead, he immediately grabbed a piece of paper and wrote down a sequence of letters, spelling out YOGTZE, with a stylized G that some later interpreted as a 6. He then crossed it out twice and left the house. After leaving the house, Günther Stoll drove to Papillon, a small pub in Winsendorf. He had visited many times before. It was late, but the place was still open. He entered alone, took a seat, and ordered a beer. There was nothing unusual in his behavior, no sign of intoxication, no agitation, and no conversation that stood out. Then, without warning, he collapsed. His body dropped forward, striking the floor. He sustained some injuries to his face, and witnesses said that he hadn't been drinking long. He hadn't seemed drunk, nor had he spoken of feeling unwell. He simply lost consciousness. Staff rushed to help him. He regained awareness quickly, confused but coherent. He didn't ask for medical attention, nor did he stay to finish his drink. Within minutes, he left the pub and returned to his car. No one knew where he was headed, and he didn't speak to anybody on the way out. The beer remained untouched, and what caused him to fall was never explained. At approximately 1 a.m, Stoll arrived in Hagerselbach, a quiet village near his hometown. He went to the home of a woman he had known since childhood. They weren't close, but she recognized him immediately when he knocked. Despite the late hour, she answered the door. He appeared tense but not erratic. His clothes were orderly, and he spoke clearly. He told her that a terrible incident was going to happen that night. He didn't say what kind, he didn't name anyone who might be involved, and he didn't explain how he knew this was happening. The statement was brief and obviously unsettling. She asked him to speak with his parents, but he refused, saying that they wouldn't understand. He didn't raise his voice, and he didn't stay long. After a few minutes, he thanked her and left. She watched him walk back to his car and drive away, and he didn't return. At approximately 3 a.m. on October 26, 1984, 2 truck drivers traveling northbound on the A45 Autobahn near the Hagenstadt exit noticed a vehicle in distress. A light-colored Volkswagen Golf had veered off the road and come to a rest in a shallow ditch. The front of the car showed signs of impact, though there were no skid marks or signs of debris that would suggest a high-speed collision. The location was remote, poorly lit, and bordered a dense roadside brush. The truck driver slowed and pulled over. As they approached the scene, they observed a man nearby. He was wearing a white jacket and walking along the shoulder close to the crash site. He didn't signal for help or attempt to speak with them. The drivers continued forward to the vehicle, unsure if the man was connected to the incident. No other cars were visible in either direction. The road was quiet, and the man in the white jacket moved out of sight. He, to this day, has never been identified. Inside the crashed Volkswagen, the truck drivers found Günther Stoll slumped in the passenger seat. He was naked, covered in blood, and severely injured. The interior of the car showed signs of disturbance, scattered items, a torn seat cover, and blood on multiple surfaces. The keys to the car were on the back window shelf. The windshield was cracked but not shattered. The driver's seat was empty, and there were no signs of forced entry, broken glass from windows, and no visible weapons. The ignition was off, and the doors were unlocked. Stoll was conscious but fading fast. He had sustained multiple injuries, including blunt force trauma to the head and chest. Abrasions across his limbs were so severe, his arm was nearly amputated, and deep bruising. His skin showed signs of exposure, suggesting that he had been outside the vehicle at some point before being placed back inside. He was able to speak briefly. He told the truck drivers that 4 men had been in the car with him. He emphasized that these men were not his friends. He couldn't name them, and he didn't describe them, and beyond that, he said nothing else. Emergency services arrived quickly, and he was loaded into an ambulance to be transported towards the nearest hospital. He lost consciousness en route and was pronounced dead before arrival. The circumstances of his injuries, however, did not match the damage to the vehicle. The crash alone couldn't account for the extent of his trauma. The location of his body, the absence of clothing, and the presence of blood inside the car raised immediate questions. Despite claims of being with 4 other persons, no other individuals were found at the crime scene. The forensic evidence started to raise immediate contradictions. Günther Stoll's injuries did not align with the damage to his vehicle. The VW Golf had sustained moderate front-end impact consistent with a low-speed collision or a controlled descent into the ditch. There were no signs of rollover, no extensive crumpling, and no interior damage that would explain the severity of Stoll's condition. Stoll, found naked in the passenger seat, had injuries that suggested he had been struck by a vehicle prior to this crash, if that's what you can call it. The trauma included deep contusions, abrasions, and fractures typical of a pedestrian impact, specifically injuries to the legs and pelvis consistent with being hit while standing upright. There were also signs of dragging and scraping that could not have occurred from inside the car. His nudity added another layer of complexity. There was no evidence that his clothing had been removed inside the vehicle. They were not found at the scene, and this supported the theory that he had been outside and unclothed at the time of the impact. Even more odd, his shoes had been found inside of his car, but no other items. The conclusion drawn by investigators was that Stoll had been hit by a different vehicle. The nature and distribution of his injuries ruled out the possibility that they had occurred during the crash of the VW Golf. The car itself showed no signs of having struck a pedestrian, no blood was found on the exterior, and no damage matched the force required to produce the trauma that Stoll had sustained. This meant that the crash was not the cause, it was a separate event. He had been injured elsewhere, then placed in the car afterwards. How he got there and who put him there remained unknown. Among many of the inconsistencies noted at the crash site, one detail stood out immediately to investigators. Günther Stoll's shoes were inside the vehicle, but his clothes were not. He was found completely naked in the passenger seat, yet there was no trace of clothing anywhere in or around the car. The area was searched thoroughly, and no garments were recovered in the ditch, the roadside brush, or the surrounding terrain. Presence of the shoes inside the car suggested that they had been placed there deliberately, or that he had potentially removed them before this incident occurred. But the absence of all other clothing raised questions. If he had undressed voluntarily, why leave only the shoes behind? If someone had removed his clothing, why take everything except the footwear? The fact the shoes were found in the car, while the other clothing were never found, added a growing evidence that Stoll had been outside the vehicle before the crash, and that someone else may have been involved in staging the scene. Forensic analysis of the VW Golf revealed no foreign DNA inside the vehicle. No fingerprints, no hair, blood, or biological matter belonging to anyone other than Günther Stoll was recovered. The interior was examined thoroughly. Steering wheel, shift gear, door handles, seat fabrics, and dashboard. All samples matched Stoll. There was no evidence that any other person had been inside the car at the time of the crash. This finding contradicted Stoll's final statements to the truck driver, in which he claimed that 4 men had been in the car with him. He said that they weren't his friends, but the absence of any physical trace suggested that he had been alone. Investigators considered the possibility that the car might have been cleaned or staged, but there were no signs of recent cleaning agents or tampering. The car had not been wiped down. It was simply devoid of any foreign biological material. The claim about 4 men remained unexplained. If real, they may have been individuals encountered earlier in the night, during the unaccounted for hours between Hagenseelbach and Hedenstad. They may have been involved in the incident that caused his injuries. They may have staged the crash to obscure what had happened, but without evidence, their existence remains purely speculative. It's also possible that the statement reflects Stoll's paranoia. He had spoken previously of unnamed individuals. Them. Those ones. They, who he believed were watching him. The number 4 may have been completely arbitrary. The phrase, "they weren't my friends," could have been a reference to betrayal, coercion, or fear. Whether literal or symbolic, the claim was never verified. The physical evidence left investigators with more questions than answers. With no witnesses, no suspect, and no clear motives, the case shifted from reconstruction to interpretation. What happened between his final known movements and the crash could not be explained by forensics alone. Theories began to form, some grounded in psychology, others in speculation. Each attempted to account for the gaps, the inconsistencies, and those final words that he had spoken before he died. One theory was that Stoll had been murdered. The evidence pointed that he had been struck by another vehicle, and if he had, was that deliberate? And it was clear to investigators that he had been injured elsewhere, but where exactly, they didn't know. And finally, who placed him in the car if he wasn't in there to begin with when he was injured and was too injured himself to open the doors? It seems suspicious that no one had stayed to help him. Leading up to his death, he had been paranoid about being murdered and that he had people around him that he believed meant him harm. And then there's the visit to his friend's home that evening. He had predicted this event. The scene did make it seem possible that he was abducted, assaulted, and then placed inside the car, with the crash as an attempt to cover up. It seemed too coincidental that a man in a white jacket was seen walking away from the scene in such a remote area. He had to have seen the wreckage and yet never flagged the truck drivers down for help. Could he have been involved? But with this theory, there's no physical evidence in the car of any person's being at the scene. There has never been a motive that makes sense as to why someone would want him dead, and no credible leads have ever surfaced. It is possible that Günther Stoll experienced a psychological break in the hours following his collapse at the bar. He had been agitated, paranoid, and erratic. If he had run into traffic, he may have been struck by another vehicle, and it's also possible that the occupants feared legal consequences, so they moved him, finding his car along the side of the road. They could have placed him back inside his own car and staged the crash before leaving the scene. He told the truck drivers that 4 men who were not his friends had been with him. If the vehicle that struck him had 4 passengers, and they were responsible for moving him, that statement may have been literal, and may have been a final attempt to identify those involved. Was the man in the white jacket one of those 4 individuals? But the lack of fingerprints, hair, or blood belonging to anyone else, especially if there had been a second crash, contradicts this theory. There were never any reports of vehicles being brought in for repairs that seemed likely to have struck a pedestrian. But both of these theories don't explain what happened to his clothes, or why he was naked, nor does it explain why his keys were on the back seat. One of the more curious events of that evening leading up to his death was the trip to the Papillon bar, where he collapsed randomly. Witnesses reported that he ordered a beer but barely touched it. He didn't seem intoxicated, which rules out drunk driving or running into the streets drunk. He fell over without any warnings. There wasn't a seizure or convulsions, and no medical history to explain what happened. He simply fell, regained consciousness quickly, and left without speaking to anyone. This could have been a panic response, but the absence of any external trigger left room for deeper neurological failure. A psychosomatic collapse, sudden and unprovoked, often signals a sign under extreme external strain. If the episode was dissociative, it may have marked the point where perception and reality began to separate. A neurological misfire could explain the abrupt loss of consciousness, with the lack of convulsions and the rapid recovery. There is no medical history to support this, but there was no physical cause either. Even more perplexing still was the word he had written down earlier that evening, YOGTZE. To this day, no one understands what it means, and perhaps in that understanding is the missing link to solving this whole mystery. As far as anyone can guess, it isn't a name or a product, nor does it match any known acronym. But this isn't mere gibberish either. With its odd spelling and unclear pronunciation, theories have abound as to what YOGTZE means. Some have even questioned if the G is actually a 6. Linguistics, cryptographers, and amateur sleuths have all weighed in. One of the more predominant theories is that YOGTZE might reference a license plate. In German, the first letter or group of letters on a plate indicates a city or district where the vehicle might have been registered. For example, M stands for Munich, B stands for Berlin. Y is reserved for military vehicles, those registered in Bundeswehr. This suggests a link to army personnel or government transport. The rest of the string complicates the theory. The G has been questioned repeatedly. In some versions, it resembles a 6. Others argue that it's an O or even a 0. Sometimes they think that the O itself might be a 0. That opens up multiple permutations. YO6TZE, YO0TZE, YOGTZE, even YOGT2E. Each variation has been tested against known plate formats, both civilian and military. None have matched. No vehicle has been traced to any combinations. No registry has confirmed a plate with that sequence. German plates also include a seal and a suffix that indicates the type of registration: private, commercial, diplomatic. None of the known suffixes align with the remaining letters in YOGTZE. If it was a plate, it may have been foreign, falsified, or incomplete. But even with substitutions and allowances for handwriting error, no confirmed plate or code has ever surfaced matching that string. The letters at the end of the string, TZE, caught early attention. They resemble the tail end of a compound, the kind of shorthand used in food processing to identify stabilizers, emulsifiers, and bacterial strains. Stoll had worked as a food engineer, so he would have been familiar with these codes, the way that they were printed on packaging, the way that they appeared in internal documentation. Yogurt production in particular involves a range of additives, some of them labeled with cryptic suffixes that vary by manufacturer and region. TZE looks like it might have belonged to that system. Investigators searched through additive registries, commercial ingredient lists, and internal coding systems used in dairy processing, but nothing matched. There was no known compound, culture, or preservative with that designation. No bacterial strain, no enzyme, no emulsifier. The letters didn't correspond to any standard used in Germany or the broader European food industry. It was as if it was a technical reference, one that had never been heard of or been documented. There was at one point speculation that it might have been a shorthand used internally at the facility where Stoll had worked, something trademarked, something not listed publicly. But no former colleague came forward with confirmation, and no archived records surfaced either. There was never any packaging or labeled samples containing that string. The theory remained plausible only because he had worked in food engineering, and the letters resembled the kind of codes used in that field. But without a match, no one can say for certain. But in that same vein, another theory emerged, one of espionage. Stoll's background in food engineering placed him in a field where chemical formulations, production standards, and regulatory oversight intersected. He had worked in environments where additives were tracked by internal codes, where documentation was precise, and where trademark compounds were sometimes handled without public disclosure. The final letters in the word he wrote, TZE, resembled the kind of suffix used in technical shorthand, particularly food processing. And that resemblance led some to believe that the word might resemble a batch identifier or formulated code. Although not frequently, Stoll had taken several trips to the Netherlands. Some had speculated that the travel was linked to industrial dealings, possibly dealings involving unlicensed compounds, regulatory violations, or border-crossing transfers of restricted materials. Theory also emerging from Stoll's professional background has suggested that YOGTZE might be a scrambled version of Zoigite. In food engineering, especially in areas involving fermentation, bacterial culture, and bioactive compounds, the concept of an origin is central. Yogurt production begins with a starter culture, a living cell line introduced in a substrain to initiate transformation. The term Zoigite, while biological, carries a parallel meaning in that context. it marks the beginning of the process, the point at which separates elements combined to form something new. I've been familiar with the language of cellular development, at least in its industrial applications. He worked in environments where microbial strains were cataloged, where growth stages were monitored, and where transformations were measured in controlled conditions. If the word he wrote was a distorted reference to zoogite, it may have reflected a technical shorthand or a conceptual anchor drawn from his work. Theories of his involvement in industrial misconduct have been examined and dismissed. No evidence has ever surfaced to support the idea that he had been involved in cross-border transfers or illicit activity. But if he had been exposed to sensitive information, or if he believed he had, it could explain why he spoke of being watched. He had mentioned people who were targeting him, and yet there was never any evidence that suggested he had conflict in his workplace. There were no reports of whistleblowers, formal complaints, or external investigations tied to his name. But in the context of his work and the absence of a clear motive, it's kept the possibility open. The word YOGTZE translates from Hebrew as to have fulfilled an obligation or to be released from a duty. It's used in religious context often to indicate that a ritual requirement has been met. In some circles, it marks the completion of a task, the end of a responsibility. The resemblance to YOGTZE has led some to speculate that the word might have been distorted translation, written under stress or misremembered. There's no record of Stoll having studied Hebrew, no indication of religious practices that would explain its use, and no linguistic ties that would make the word familiar to him. However, the same implication has been seen in other cases. For example, the Somerton Man case. In 1948, a man was found dead on a beach near Adelaide, dressed in formal clothing with no identification and no signs of trauma. Hidden in a fob pocket was a scrap piece of paper with 2 words, Tamashut. The phrase was taken from the final page of a Parisian poetry book and translates to ended or finished. The book itself was later recovered from a car parked nearby, and inside were handwritten sequences, letters, numbers, a phone number, none of which led to a confirmed identity. The man's dental records didn't match any known profiles, his fingerprints weren't in any database, and his clothing had been stripped of labels. The cause of death was never determined. Toxology was inconclusive. The note remained the only clue, and it offered no explanation. In both cases, a single word and its use, placement, and timing suggest some sort of religious or ritualistic purpose, as both are phrases that appear in ceremonial context, and both are words that suggest closure. While not religious himself, Stoll had spoken of others who seemed to be stalking him or meant to harm him. Perhaps this word could have been linked to their involvement somehow. However, there's no evidence that confirms the word Stoll wrote is even Hebrew. In April 1985, the case was broadcast on a German television program focused on unresolved crimes. Following the segment, several amateur radio operators contacted the station with a specific observation. They proposed that the string of letters Stoll had written, YOGTZE, might have been misread. If the G were actually a 6, the sequence would have matched existing Romanian ham radio call signs. YO6TZE. That format, beginning with YO, aligns with Romanian's national prefix for amateur radio identifiers. The number 6 designates a regional zone, and the final 3 letters serve as a unique station suffix. The structure was valid under international radio regulations at the time. The suggestion was taken seriously enough to be investigators. If the note referred to a radio station, it could imply a contact point, a transmission, or a reference to a location. The call sign format was consistent with known standards, and the substitution of a 6 for a G was plausible given the limitations of the handwriting and the absence of a photograph of the original note. However, no Romanian operator with that call sign was ever identified, and transmissions were never recorded or traced. Furthermore, radio equipment was never found in Stoll's possession, nor was there any proof that he held a license, used a receiver, or had involvement in amateur radio. An additional problem was that even if the interpretation of the note was in fact a call sign or an external registry, it still didn't explain the circumstances of his death. In April of 2025, the German authorities formally closed the investigation into Stoll's death. Their final report had classified the incident as a single-vehicle accident. According to these new findings, Stoll had exited his home in a state of mental distress, entered a vehicle alone, and suffered fatal injuries after a crash on a rural road. The report states that the injuries were consistent with the impact trauma, and no evidence was presented to suggest involvement of others. To most, the official conclusion didn't account for several unresolved elements: the location of the crash, the condition in which Stoll was discovered, naked, severely injured with a nearly severed arm, and a car's interior that showed no signs of a typical collision, raised questions that this conclusion never clarified. When the truck drivers found him, they had witnessed a man wearing a white jacket walking near the crash site who seemed somewhat injured. This explanation doesn't give any account for this person, and also doesn't explain the absence of clothing, which were never found at the crash site or elsewhere. The car keys were also located on the rear shelf, not in the ignition or on his person. How had that been operating the vehicle? The key's placement is inconsistent with the accident dynamics, as does the position of his body in the passenger side of the vehicle, not the driver's side. How is it possible he ended up on the opposite side of the car with the extreme state of his injuries? Independent researchers and amateur investigators question the logic of the conclusion. The decision to close the case without resolving these inconsistencies gave the impression that the inquiry had narrowed down to fit a predetermined outcome. If the failure to account for the physical anomalies had been done purposefully to officially close the investigation, for what purpose, and whose benefit does this serve? Stoll's case is not the only investigation that has been shaped, defined, or complicated by a single word or phrase. In 1970, Norwegian police discovered the burnt body of a woman in Isdalen Valley near Bergen. She carried multiple passports, traveled under aliases, and left behind coded notes that documented her movements. One line in particular, "Suicide by poison," was found in a suitcase linked to her. The phrase appeared in a context that suggested she died by her own hand, but the surrounding evidence of her death, such as reports of her being followed through the woods by men in black suits and her body being burned, contradict this idea. Her identity was never confirmed, and the meaning of the note remains unresolved. In 1587, the Roanoke colony vanished without a trace. The only clue left behind was a single word carved into a tree: Croatoan. It referred to a nearby island and local tribe, but no bodies were recovered. There were no signs of struggle, and no definitive explanation was ever established. The word became a marker of the disappearance, later surfacing in unrelated context, including the final days of Edgar Allan Poe. In 1999, Ricky McCormick was discovered dead in a Missouri field. 2 encrypted notes were discovered in his pockets. The FBI has never been able to decipher them. The only known statement he made before his death was, "They are after me." The notes contained no recognizable cipher, and no motive was ever identified. This case remains open. In 2013, Isla Lamb was found in a sealed water tank atop the Sicily Hotel in Los Angeles. Her final movements were captured in an elevator surveillance footage that showed erratic behavior. While she left no written message, her Tumblr posts in the weeks prior included fragmented thoughts and references to being followed. One line, "I'm going to walk the back garden," was noted for its ambiguity. Her death was ruled accidental, but the circumstances surrounding it continue to generate scrutiny. We may never know what actually happened to Günther Stoll. The word YOGTZE might have been a product of a fractured state of mind, a meaningless fragment with no connection to the events that followed. But it could also be the key. If the letters referenced a compound, a call sign, or a coded designation, they might point to something larger. Stoll had worked in food engineering. If he had uncovered a classified experiment involving mass-produced additives, the implications would extend beyond his personal history. Could it be a license plate? If military personnel were involved, even peripherally, the scope of the case would shift. Leading up to this, he seemed like an everyday, normal man. And if something like this could happen to us, could it happen to anyone? The word remains, and the trail bends, and the questions outlast the answers. Until next time, I'm Amanda Joy. Keep wandering the path. It remembers more than it reveals.